The words hit me like ice water through the kitchen window. My husband of 32 years telling his poker buddies that I was such a burden, always needing something, can't even manage her own medications anymore. I stood there in my own garden, pruning shears frozen in my hand, listening to him laugh about how he had to babysit his wife while they played cards in what used to be our shared living room. What Gary didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the helpless woman they were discussing had just quietly transferred $18 million into accounts he'd never seen. I suppose I should start from the beginning, though the beginning feels like someone else's life now. 32 years ago, I was Jennifer Hamilton, 28 years old, with a business degree from Northwestern and a head for numbers that impressed every accounting firm in Chicago. That's where I met Gary, charming, ambitious Gary with his easy smile and grand plans for the construction company his father had left him. He swept me off my feet with talk of building something together, of being partners in every sense of the word. For the first decade, we were partners. I handled the books, managed the crew's payroll, negotiated contracts with suppliers, and somehow still managed to raise our two children, David and Sarah. The company grew from a small residential outfit to a major commercial contractor, and I'd like to think my financial management had something to do with that success. We bought the house in Lake Forest, took family vacations to Europe, put both kids through private school without taking loans. Life was good, or so I thought. But memory is a strange thing, isn't it? Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed at the time. Little comments that seemed like jokes but had edges sharp enough to cut. Jennifer's got her little system for everything, Gary would tell clients, making my detailed financial tracking sound like a hobby rather than professional management. Or, you know how women are with numbers. They get all the details but miss the big picture. Delivered with that indulgent smile that was supposed to take the sting out. I told myself he was just being playful, that this was normal married couple banter. After all, he still relied on my work, still needed my expertise to keep the business running smoothly. But gradually, insidiously, those little comments began to shape how other people saw me, and eventually, how I began to see myself. The shift happened so gradually, I almost missed it. First, Gary started handling more of the financial decisions himself. "You've got enough on your plate with the kids," he'd say, taking over meetings with the bank. It seemed reasonable. David was in high school, Sarah was starting her college applications, and I was juggling their schedules with my work for the company. But when I tried to stay involved in the bigger picture, Gary would pat my hand and say, "Don't worry about it, honey. I've got this handled." Then he moved my name off the primary business account. "Simplifies the paperwork," he explained when I questioned it. "The bank only needs one signature for most transactions anyway." I remember standing in our kitchen that morning, holding the new signature cards, feeling something cold settle in my stomach that I couldn't quite name. It was the first time I realized that I could be erased from something I'd helped build, simply by moving my name from one line to another. Slowly, deliberately, he began treating my contributions like helpful suggestions rather than professional expertise. In meetings with contractors, he'd interrupt my explanations about payment schedules to offer his own simplified version, as if I hadn't been the one who'd negotiated those terms in the first place. When suppliers called with questions about invoices, Gary would take the phone from my hand. "Let me handle this, Jennifer. You know how confusing these guys can make things sound." By the time David graduated college and Sarah finished her master's degree, I realized I'd become invisible in my own marriage. The woman who'd helped build a multi-million-dollar business was now asked to fetch coffee when Gary met with clients. The woman who'd managed complex commercial contracts was told she probably wouldn't understand when discussion turned to business matters. I had become in my own home what I'd never been in any other context, a supporting character in someone else's story. But here's what Gary never understood about the kind of woman he'd married. I might have let him push me out of the business decisions, might have accepted his increasingly condescending explanations of financial matters I'd been handling before he even knew what a P&L statement was, but I never stopped thinking. I never stopped analyzing, and I certainly never stopped watching. You see, there's a particular kind of humiliation that comes from being treated like you're stupid by someone who used to respect your intelligence. It's not like the sudden shock of betrayal or the clean pain of an honest fight. It's a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone, until you start to question things you've always known about yourself. Did I really understand those financial projections as well as I thought? Was my analysis of market trends actually valuable? Or had Gary just been humoring me all these years? But Gary made a crucial mistake in his gradual campaign to diminish me. He assumed that because he'd pushed me out of the day-to-day business operations, I'd lost my understanding of finance altogether. What he didn't realize was that I'd spent the last 15 years quietly building something he knew nothing about, using the same skills he'd convinced himself I didn't possess. My grandmother had left me a small inheritance when I turned 30, about $50,000 that seemed insignificant compared to the money flowing through Gary's construction business. It was from the sale of her little house in Evanston, the one where she'd lived alone for 20 years after my grandfather died, managing her own finances with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker until the day she passed away at 89. I remember the day I got the check, sitting in the kitchen of our old house, the smaller one we'd lived in before the business really took off. Gary glanced at the amount and shrugged. Nice little windfall, but not enough to worry about. Why don't you put it in savings for now? Figure out what to do with it later. Instead of mentioning it again or folding it into our joint assets, I decided to honor my grandmother's memory by treating that money with the same careful attention she had always given to her finances. I opened an investment account in my maiden name, something I told myself was just a precaution, a way to keep track of money that had sentimental value. What started as sentiment became something much more substantial. I invested carefully, methodically, using the same financial acumen that had helped build Gary's company. I read everything: annual reports, market analyses, economic forecasts. I tracked emerging industries, studied demographic trends, analyzed risk factors with the same attention to detail I'd once brought to construction contracts. 50,000 became 100,000, then 200,000. I reinvested dividends, made careful stock picks, bought and sold real estate in my maiden name. When tech stocks soared in the late 90s, I was positioned to benefit. When the market crashed in 2008, I'd already moved my assets into safer investments. While Gary was scrambling to keep his construction business afloat during the recession, my portfolio was growing steadily. The irony was delicious. While Gary increasingly treated me like I couldn't balance a checkbook, I was quietly out-earning his precious construction company. My investment portfolio had grown to $18 million, all held in accounts and trusts he didn't even know existed. Every quarter, I'd review statements that showed returns that would have made his business partners weep with envy, and then I'd go downstairs to listen to him explain basic financial concepts to me, like I was a promising but slow student. I kept detailed records of everything, not just the investments, but Gary's behavior patterns. I started to notice how he'd time his most condescending comments for when we had an audience. How he'd correct things I said that were perfectly accurate, then repeat the same information in slightly different words as if he was clarifying my confusion. How he'd developed a whole repertoire of facial expressions, the patient smile, the gentle headshake, the look of fond exasperation that he'd deploy whenever I expressed an opinion about anything more complex than dinner plans. The medication comment was what finally broke something inside me. 6 months earlier, I'd had what the doctors called a minor episode, stress-related dizziness that landed me in the emergency room for a few hours. The tests had shown nothing serious, just elevated blood pressure from stress and perhaps a touch of dehydration. But Gary had seized on that incident like it was proof of everything he'd been saying about my declining capabilities. Since then, he'd appointed himself my medical manager, doling out my single daily multivitamin like it was life-saving medication, making a great show of helping me remember appointments I'd been managing myself for decades. He'd bought one of those weekly pill containers, the kind with compartments for each day, and would fill it ceremoniously every Sunday evening, explaining to anyone who'd listen how he had to stay on top of Jennifer's medications because she gets confused about what to take when. The truth was, I took one multivitamin a day. One. A basic, over-the-counter vitamin that I'd been taking for years, more out of habit than necessity. I had no prescription medications, no complex medical regimen, no cognitive issues that would make remembering a single vitamin difficult. But Gary had built an entire narrative around my supposed inability to manage this simple task, and worse, he'd convinced our children and friends that this narrative was true. But standing in the garden that Tuesday afternoon, listening to him tell his friends how I couldn't even manage my own medications, I realized this wasn't about concern for my health. This was about control, about maintaining a narrative where Gary was the competent provider and I was the grateful dependent. And more than that, it was about him believing his own lies so completely that he'd forgotten they were lies at all. I stayed in the garden for another hour after his friends left, pruning roses that didn't need pruning, trying to process what I'd heard. The cruelest part wasn't even the words themselves. It was the casual way he'd said them, the easy laughter from his friends, the comfortable assumption that this was just how things were. Poor Gary, stuck with a wife who was becoming more of a burden every year. When I finally went inside, Gary was cleaning up the poker table, counting his winnings with the satisfied air of a man who'd had a good evening. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or just the faintest awareness that I might have heard something I wasn't supposed to. "Good game tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Pretty good. Won about $60. He paused, then added, "You were out in the garden for a while. Everything okay?" "Just enjoying the evening air. The roses are coming along nicely." He nodded, already losing interest, already moving on to whatever he'd planned to do next. That's when I realized how completely he'd compartmentalized me. I was the woman who tended gardens and needed help with vitamins, separate and distinct from the woman who'd once been his business partner. In his mind, those were two different people, and only one of them was worth respecting. That night, after Gary had gone to bed, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the breakfast nook where I'd once spread out financial documents for the business. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Sheridan Road. I pulled out my tablet, the one he'd given me last Christmas, with a patronizing comment about how I might enjoy playing games on it. Instead of games, I opened my investment portfolio summary and stared at the numbers that represented 15 years of careful strategic financial management. $18 million. $18 million that I'd earned through my own intelligence, my own research, my own disciplined approach to risk and reward. I'd built this nest egg while being told I didn't understand money, had grown this portfolio while being treated like I couldn't manage my own medication schedule. I thought about my grandmother then, about the meticulous records she kept, the way she'd managed every penny with quiet dignity even when my grandfather and then my father had tried to help her with financial decisions. She'd taught me that a woman's financial independence was the foundation of every other kind of freedom, but I'd forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way. I'd let myself be convinced that partnership meant deferring to someone else's expertise, even when that expertise was demonstrably inferior to my own. The next morning, I called my attorney, not the family lawyer who'd handled our wills and house closings, but a divorce specialist I'd researched carefully. Catherine Morrison had a reputation for protecting women's assets in complex divorces, particularly when there were significant separate property issues involved. "I need to discuss my options," I told her over the phone. "Are you in immediate danger?" she asked. "No, nothing like that. I just need to understand what my rights are." We met the following Tuesday at her office in downtown Evanston. Catherine was younger than I'd expected, probably Sarah's age, but her questions were sharp and thorough. She took careful notes as I explained my situation, the gradual erosion of respect, the public humiliation, the systematic undermining of my confidence. "Tell me about your finances, Wolkel," she said. "That's complicated." I explained about the investment portfolio, about the careful record keeping, about the separate accounts Gary didn't know existed. Catherine's eyebrows rose higher with each figure I mentioned. $18 million in separate property, she repeated. All documented, all traceable to my grandmother's inheritance and my own investment decisions, never commingled with marital assets. "Mrs. Hamilton, do you realize what this means for your divorce?" "I think so, but I want to be sure." Catherine smiled for the first time since I'd walked into her office. "It means you have options most women in your situation don't have. It means you can leave this marriage without worrying about financial security. More than that, it means you have leverage." We spent the next 2 hours going through documents, investment statements, account records, the careful trail of paperwork I'd maintained for 15 years. Catherine was impressed with my documentation, but more than that, she was angry on my behalf. This pattern of behavior you're describing, the public undermining, the infantilization, the gradual isolation from business decisions, this is emotional abuse, she said. Just because it's subtle doesn't make it less harmful. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. "You're not overreacting. You're underreacting, if anything. Most women in your position would have left years ago if they'd had the financial means." That evening, armed with Catherine's advice and a clearer understanding of my legal rights, I decided it was time to have a conversation with Gary. I waited until after dinner, when he was settled in his favorite chair with the evening paper, comfortable and unsuspecting. "Gary Tokyo," I called from the kitchen. "Could you come here for a moment?" He appeared in the doorway, still carrying the sports section, with the slightly irritated expression of someone who'd been interrupted during his relaxation time. "What is it, Maggie? I'm trying to catch up on the Cubs scores." "I heard what you said yesterday, about me being a burden." His face went through several expressions: surprise, guilt, then the practiced innocence he'd perfected over the years. Oh, honey, you know how guys talk. I didn't mean anything by it. Actually, I think you meant exactly what you said, and I think it's time we talked about what kind of burden I really am. I pulled out my tablet and opened my investment portfolio summary. The numbers glowed on the screen like a secret finally ready to be revealed. This is interesting reading, I said, turning the screen toward him. Apparently, this burden you've been carrying has been rather successful with money. Gary squinted at the screen, and I watched his expression change as the numbers registered. The dismissive impatience faded first, replaced by confusion, then something that looked almost like fear. What is this? That's my investment portfolio, Gary. The money I've been managing while you've been telling people I can't handle my medication schedule. His face had gone very pale. $18 million? Where did this come from? My grandmother's inheritance. You remember? The little bit of money you said wasn't worth worrying about 15 years ago? I took your advice and didn't worry about it. I just invested it. Carefully, methodically, using the same financial skills you decided I didn't have anymore. I could see him trying to process this, trying to figure out the implications, trying to reconcile the woman he'd been describing to his friends with the evidence on the screen in front of him. But this is marital property. We're married. This belongs to both of us. Actually, no. This money was inherited by me before our marriage, kept in separate accounts, and invested using my expertise. But you're right that we need to discuss our marital finances. I pulled out another document, one I'd had Catherine prepare the day before. These are the business records for Hamilton Construction for the past 10 years, I said, using my maiden name deliberately. Interesting thing about those records, they show that the company's most profitable years coincided exactly with the years I was most involved in financial management. Since you took over completely, profits have declined by 37%. Gary was staring at the papers like they contained writing in a foreign language. Where did you get these? I have my sources. The point is, Gary, that the burden you've been complaining about actually contributed more to your success than you want to admit. And now that burden is worth considerably more than the company you've been so protective of. I watched him do the math in his head. 18 million versus the construction company's value of maybe 3 million on a good day. The power dynamic in our marriage had just shifted so dramatically that he was visibly struggling to find his footing. Maggie, I don't understand what you're trying to say. But I could see in his eyes that he understood perfectly. The comfortable narrative he'd built, successful businessman with declining wife, had just crumbled in the space of 5 minutes. What I'm saying is that I've been thinking about your poker friend's advice. They're right. You shouldn't have to carry such a burden, so I'm going to make it easy for you. I slid the final document across the table. Divorce papers. I've already signed them. The color drained completely from his face. Divorce? Maggie, you can't be serious. We've been married 32 years. Exactly. 32 years of gradually being made to feel smaller, less capable, more dependent. 32 years of watching you take credit for successes we built together, then pushing me aside when you decided you didn't need me anymore. But I never said I didn't need you. No, you just told your friends I was a burden who couldn't manage her own medication. Let me ask you something, Gary. Do you even know what medication I take? He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. You take, for your blood pressure. I take a multivitamin, Gary. 1 multivitamin a day. I don't have high blood pressure. I never have. The episode 6 months ago was exhaustion from stress. Stress from living with someone who treats me like I'm incompetent. I watched him realize that even his narrative about my helplessness was built on assumptions rather than facts. You've been managing a multivitamin, Chikinelli. I continued. 1 vitamin, that I'm perfectly capable of remembering myself. But it made you feel important, didn't it? Made you feel needed. Made a good story for the poker table about how you have to take care of your poor, declining wife. Maggie, please. I know I've made mistakes, but we can work this out. We can go to counseling. Counseling is for marriages where both people respect each other. You can't counsel someone into respecting their partner. I stood up, collecting my documents. The papers are straightforward. I'm keeping my investments, my inheritance, and my maiden name. You can keep the construction company and the house. I'm sure you'll be much happier without such a burden dragging you down. You can't just leave. Where will you go? I've purchased a lovely condo in downtown Chicago, Lakeview, Dorman, very nice building. I put the offer in 3 weeks ago, right after I heard you telling our neighbor how you had to take care of everything because I was getting so forgetful. Gary was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. You bought a condo? How did you? When did you? While you were busy explaining to people how incompetent I am, I was busy proving how competent I actually am. Amazing what a woman can accomplish when she stops waiting for their permission. I walked toward the kitchen door, then turned back. Oh, and Gary? That business about not being able to manage my medication? You might want to be more careful about what stories you tell. I've been recording our conversations for the past month. Amazing what they make phones capable of these days. The look of panic that crossed his face was almost comical. Recording? What do you mean, recording? I mean, I have documentation of you deliberately undermining my confidence, making false claims about my mental state, and discussing our private medical matters with your friends. My attorney found it all very interesting. You can't use those recordings. That's illegal. Actually, Illinois is a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, and I certainly knew, it's perfectly legal. My attorney was quite pleased with the evidence. I could see him mentally reviewing every condescending comment, every public joke at my expense, every time he'd made me feel small in front of others. The recordings will make the divorce proceedings much simpler, I continued. No question about emotional abuse, no question about your pattern of undermining me. Very clean, very straightforward. Maggie, wait, please. I know I haven't appreciated you the way I should. But $18 million? You could have told me. We could have been partners again. Partners? I almost laughed. Gary, when was the last time you asked my opinion about anything important? When was the last time you treated me like an equal in any decision? He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him trying to remember, trying to find an example that would prove me wrong. I don't know. I do. It was 8 years ago when you were deciding whether to bid on the Morrison office complex. You asked what I thought, listened to my analysis, and took my advice. We got the contract, and it was one of your most profitable jobs, but that was the last time you treated my judgment as valuable. I can change. We can go back to being partners. No, Gary, you can't go back. You can only go forward. And going forward, I'm going to be my own partner. I left him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers and trying to process how completely his world had shifted in the space of 20 minutes. The next few weeks were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Gary tried every strategy in his playbook: anger, bargaining, attempting to rally our children to his side, even showing up at my new condo with flowers and promises to change. But the most telling reactions came from the people who'd been watching our marriage from the outside. Our neighbor Helen caught me in the driveway one morning as I was loading boxes into my car. Jennifer, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I'm glad you're finally standing up for yourself. I paused, a box of books balanced in my arms. What do you mean? Oh, honey, we've all seen how Gary talks to you, treats you like you can't tie your own shoes. My Harold tried that nonsense with me once, about 20 years ago. I told him he could shape up or ship out, and he shaped up real quick. It turned out that what I thought was my private humiliation had been visible to everyone around us. Helen wasn't the only one. The mailman mentioned how nice it was to see me getting back out there. The pharmacist asked if I was feeling better now that I seemed more like myself. Even the teenager who bagged groceries at the local market said she was glad to see me smiling again. Had I really been that obviously diminished? Had everyone been watching me shrink for years, waiting for me to find my backbone again? The most telling moment came when David called me, clearly coached by his father. Mom, Dad says you're making a huge mistake. He says you're being emotional and not thinking clearly about the finances. What did he tell you about the finances, sweetheart? He said you don't understand how much the divorce will cost both of you, how you're going to regret giving up your security. I was quiet for a moment, choosing my words carefully. Did he mention my investment portfolio? Your what? Ask your father about my investment portfolio, David. Ask him how much security I'm actually giving up. When David called back 3 hours later, his tone was completely different. Mom, Dad said, he said you have $18 million. Is that true? It's true. And you earned that yourself? I did. There was a long pause. Mom, I owe you an apology. We all do. Dad's been telling us for years that you needed taking care of, that you weren't good with practical things anymore. I should have questioned that. You believed what you were told, honey. That's natural. But I should have seen. I mean, you raised us, managed a household, helped build Dad's business. When did we all decide you'd become helpless? That conversation was more healing than I'd expected. Both David and Sarah started calling more frequently, wanting to hear my side of stories they'd only heard from their father. They began to see the patterns they'd missed, how Gary had gradually repositioned himself as my caretaker rather than my partner, how he'd trained even them to see me as someone who needed managing rather than someone who deserved respect. Sarah was particularly angry when she learned about the medication charade. He told us you were having memory problems with your medications. We were worried about you. I know, sweetheart, but as you can see, my memory is working just fine. This is horrible, Mom. How long has he been lying to us about you? I don't think he sees it as lying exactly. I think he's told these stories so often that he started believing them himself. It's easier to see me as declining than to admit that he's the one who changed. The divorce proceedings were remarkably smooth, thanks to Catherine's meticulous preparation and the evidence I'd gathered. Gary's lawyer, a slightly overweight man in his 50s, who clearly underestimated both Catherine and me, tried to argue for half of my investment portfolio, but my documentation was ironclad. Separate property, premarital inheritance, no commingling of funds, detailed records going back 15 years. The business records I'd obtained also supported my position beautifully. When Gary's lawyer tried to paint me as a dependent spouse who'd contributed nothing to the marital estate, Catherine presented evidence of my contributions to the construction company's success, along with the detailed analysis showing the decline in profits since my exclusion from financial decisions. Your Honor, Catherine said during one particularly memorable hearing, Mrs. Hamilton isn't seeking anything from Mr. Hamilton's business or assets. She's simply asking to keep what she earned independently through her own financial expertise. Expertise that, ironically, Mr. Hamilton has spent the last several years claiming she doesn't possess. But the recordings were what really sealed the case. Gary's own words in his own voice, making it clear that he viewed me as a burden rather than a partner. His comments about my supposed cognitive decline, played back in the sterile atmosphere of a conference room, sounded even more cruel than they had in our kitchen. The judge was particularly unimpressed with Gary's attempt to claim concern for my welfare. Mr. Hamilton, she said during one hearing, these recordings suggest that you've been systematically undermining your wife's confidence while simultaneously disparaging her capabilities to others. That doesn't sound like the behavior of a concerned spouse. Your Honor, I was just trying to help. By telling your friends she can't manage her own medication? By describing her as a burden? Mr. Hamilton, I've reviewed Mrs. Hamilton's financial records. The woman you've been describing as incompetent has built an $18 million portfolio through careful investment strategies. Either you're deliberately misrepresenting her capabilities, or you're remarkably unobservant for someone who's been married to her for 32 years. Gary's final offer was generous by normal divorce standards. Half the house value, a portion of the business, spousal support that would have kept me comfortable for life. But it was still based on the assumption that I needed his financial support to survive. Counteroffer, Catherine said simply, Mrs. Hamilton keeps her separate property investments. Mr. Hamilton keeps the business and the house. No spousal support requested from either party. The look on Gary's lawyer's face was priceless. No spousal support? Mrs. Hamilton is walking away from significant marital assets. Mrs. Hamilton has assets of her own, Catherine replied. She has no need for Mr. Hamilton's financial support. When the divorce was finally finalized, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete autonomy. No one to ask permission from, no one to downplay my capabilities to, no one treating my intelligence like a charming quirk rather than a valuable asset. I signed the final papers with my maiden name, Jennifer Hamilton, and walked out of that courthouse feeling like myself for the first time in decades. I celebrated by doing something I'd wanted to do for years. I enrolled in a graduate program in financial planning at Northwestern, the same university where I'd earned my undergraduate degree more than 30 years earlier. At 60, I decided I wanted formal credentials to go with my practical experience. The first day of classes was intimidating in ways I hadn't expected. My classmates were mostly young professionals, earnest and ambitious, and slightly unsure what to make of the silver-haired woman taking notes in the front row. But they quickly learned that the older woman in the corner had insights that only come from decades of real-world experience. Mrs. Hamilton, one of them said, after I'd helped the group work through a particularly complex case study involving retirement planning, "What made you decide to go back to school?" I realized I'd spent too many years letting other people define what I was capable of, I said. I decided it was time to define that for myself. The professor overheard and smiled. "Mrs. Hamilton, would you be interested in guest lecturing for our investment strategies course? Your perspective would be valuable." 6 months later, I was teaching 2 courses per semester and loving every minute of it. Students would stay after class to ask questions not just about finance, but about life, about finding confidence, about not letting others diminish their capabilities. I discovered that teaching wasn't just about sharing knowledge, it was about empowering people to trust their own intelligence. One young woman, probably Sarah's age, approached me after a particularly intense lecture on portfolio diversification. Her name was Jessica, and she reminded me of myself at that age. Smart, ambitious, but somehow uncertain about her own expertise. "Professor Hamilton, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "My boyfriend keeps telling me I'm not good with money, that I should let him handle our investments. But I have a finance degree and I work at an investment firm. How do I know if he's right?" I looked at this bright, accomplished young woman and saw myself 30 years ago, starting to doubt my own expertise because someone I loved was telling me I should. "What's your track record at work?" I asked. "I manage portfolios for 12 clients, and I've outperformed the market by an average of 3% over the past 2 years. "And what's your boyfriend's financial background?" "He's a marketing manager, no formal training in finance." "Trust your education and your experience, Bahar?" I told her. If someone who loves you is consistently undermining your professional confidence, that's not love. That's control. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "That's what I was afraid you'd say." "But it's also what you needed to hear, isn't it?" Yes, it is." These conversations became common. Women in my classes, women at faculty events, women I met at coffee shops or bookstores, all carrying stories of being told they weren't good enough, smart enough, capable enough, all believing on some level that the people telling them these things must be right. I started writing about it, first just journal entries for myself, then articles for financial planning publications, and then eventually a book. The Capable Woman, Reclaiming Your Financial Power After Others Have Diminished It, became something of a phenomenon, particularly among women over 50 who recognized their own stories in my experiences. The book tour was surreal. City after city filled with women who'd been told they couldn't manage money, couldn't understand investments, couldn't be trusted with important financial decisions. Women who'd built businesses, raised families, earned advanced degrees, and still somehow internalized the message that they needed someone else to handle the complicated stuff. In Denver, a woman in her 70s stood up during the Q&A portion. She was tiny, probably barely 5 feet tall, but she commanded the room when she spoke. "My son-in-law has been managing my finances since my husband died," she said. "He tells me I don't understand the markets, that I should just trust him, but my account keeps losing money, and when I ask questions, he says I'm worrying too much." "What did you do before you retired?" I asked. "I was a mathematics professor. I taught calculus and statistics for 40 years. The audience gasped, then began to murmur angrily. Here was a woman who'd spent her career teaching complex mathematical concepts, being told she couldn't understand investment basics. "I think," I said gently, "that someone who taught statistics for 40 years is perfectly capable of understanding market principles. Your son-in-law is either incompetent or dishonest, and either way, you deserve better." She came up to me after the event, tears streaming down her face. I knew something was wrong, but I thought maybe I really was too old to understand. "You're not too old to understand anything," I told her. "You're just too valuable to waste on people who don't appreciate your intelligence." 6 months later, she sent me a letter. She'd taken control of her own portfolio, fired her son-in-law as her financial manager, and recovered most of her losses through better investment choices. She'd also started a financial literacy group for seniors at her local community center. "You saved my retirement," she wrote, "but more than that, you reminded me who I used to be." These stories kept coming. Women discovering that their inability to handle money was actually someone else's need for control. Women realizing that their intelligence and capabilities hadn't diminished, they'd just been convinced to hide them. I thought about Gary sometimes, wondering if he ever realized what he'd lost. David told me he'd remarried, a younger woman who apparently appreciated being taken care of. Her name was Brenda. She was 42 to Gary's 67, and according to Sarah, she seemed perfectly content to let Gary manage everything from their joint checking account to her car insurance. I wish them well, genuinely. Gary needed someone who wanted to be managed, and I needed someone who didn't need to manage me. But the real revelation came about a year after our divorce was finalized, when David called with news that made everything crystallize in a way I hadn't expected. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Dad's business." "What about it?" "It's in trouble. Real trouble. He's been making some pretty bad decisions since you left, and the company's hemorrhaging money." I felt a complicated mix of emotions, not quite satisfaction, but something close to vindication. "What kind of decisions?" "Well, remember that Peterson development project he was so excited about? The one he said was going to set the company up for the next 5 years?" "I remember him mentioning it." "He bid way too low on the contract. Didn't account for material cost increases. Didn't build in enough buffer for weather delays. They're 3 months behind schedule and about $200,000 over budget." I closed my eyes, remembering the countless times I'd warned Gary about bidding too aggressively, about the importance of building contingencies into construction contracts. It was exactly the kind of mistake I'd prevented dozens of times during our partnership. "There's more to cover," David continued. "He invested most of the company's cash reserves in some get-rich-quick scheme his new wife's brother recommended. Some kind of cryptocurrency thing that went bust." "Oh, David." "The worst part is, I tried to talk to him about it. I told him maybe he should get some professional financial advice, maybe bring in a consultant. And you know what he said?" I had a feeling I knew, but I let David tell me. He said he didn't need advice from anyone, that he'd been managing finances longer than most people had been alive. He actually got angry at me for suggesting he needed help. There it was, the same arrogance that had led him to push me out of financial decisions, the same refusal to admit that anyone else might know something he didn't. Gary had spent so many years believing his own story about being the financial expert in our marriage that he'd forgotten how much he'd actually relied on my analysis and oversight. "I'm sorry, honey. I know this must be stressful for you." "It is, but not for the reasons you might think. I'm not worried about the money. I'm doing fine on my own. I'm worried about Dad. He seems so lost, like he doesn't know how to make decisions without someone to bounce ideas off of." "Someone like Brenda?" "Mom, Brenda's sweet, but she doesn't know the first thing about business. She just smiles and nods when Dad talks about work stuff. It's like watching him have a conversation with himself." I realized then that Gary hadn't just lost a wife when our marriage ended. He'd lost his closest advisor, his sounding board, his financial safety net. For all his public dismissal of my capabilities, he had been unconsciously relying on my judgment for decades. Without that steady influence, without someone who understood both the business and his tendency toward overconfidence, he was making exactly the kinds of mistakes I'd spent years helping him avoid. "What will happen to the company?" I asked. "I think he's going to have to sell it. There's talk of Hamilton Construction being bought out by Morrison and Associates. Ironically, the same company that built the office complex you helped him win the contract for all those years ago." The symmetry was almost poetic. The success I'd helped orchestrate was now poised to absorb the failure that had come from my absence. 2 years after the divorce, I met James at a faculty mixer. He was a literature professor at Northwestern, recently widowed, with kind eyes and a quick wit. When I told him about my investment portfolio, his reaction was immediate enthusiasm. "That's incredible! You must be brilliant with numbers. I can barely balance my checkbook. Would you be willing to help me understand my retirement planning?" It was such a refreshing change from Gary's approach that I almost laughed. Here was a man recognizing my expertise and asking for help, rather than assuming I needed his guidance. "I'd be happy to help," I said. "Though you might want to get a second opinion from someone who's not personally interested in you." He smiled. "Are you personally interested in me?" "I'm considering it." Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine appreciation for each other's strengths. James never once suggested that I didn't understand something, never talked down to me, never tried to protect me from the complex topics. When we discussed his finances, he listened to my advice with the attention of someone who valued expertise wherever he found it. "You know what I love about you?" he said one evening as we walked along Lake Michigan, about 6 months into our relationship. "My charming personality? Well, that too. But what I really love is how you know things, really know them. When you explain investment strategies or talk about market trends, you're not just repeating what someone else told you. You understand it down to the bones." Gary used to say I got too caught up in details. Gary was an idiot, James said simply. Details are where competence lives. Anyone can understand the big picture if it's explained simply enough. It takes real expertise to handle the details. When we married 2 years later, we kept our finances separate by mutual agreement. Not because we didn't trust each other, but because we both valued the independence we'd worked so hard to achieve. James had his retirement accounts and his professor's pension. I had my investment portfolio and my growing income from teaching and book royalties. We split household expenses fairly, consulted each other on major purchases, and maintained complete transparency about our financial situations without feeling the need to merge everything into joint control. The wedding was small, just family and close friends. David and Sarah were there, beaming with happiness for me. Even Gary sent a card, a surprisingly gracious note, wishing me well and thanking me for the years we'd shared. I appreciated the gesture, though I suspected it had more to do with his current financial troubles than any real personal growth. But the moment that meant the most was when James stood up to make a toast. "To Jennifer Bouquet," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that the most attractive quality in a person is competence, and the most beautiful thing in a relationship is two people making each other stronger rather than smaller." I thought about that toast often in the years that followed. It captured something essential about what I'd learned, that love shouldn't require you to diminish yourself, that partnership should amplify your capabilities rather than hide them. The financial planning courses continued, the book speaking engagements continued, and gradually I built something I'd never had before, a professional identity that was entirely my own. Not someone's wife, not someone's mother, not someone's burden. Just Jennifer Hamilton, financial planner, professor, and advocate for women's economic empowerment. My investment portfolio continued to grow, reaching $30 million by my 68th birthday. I was more financially secure than I'd ever imagined possible, but more than that, I was intellectually engaged in ways that energized rather than drained me. I was consulting with investment firms, serving on nonprofit boards, mentoring young women in finance, and writing my second book. The Invisible Contributor: How Women's Financial Expertise Gets Erased in Marriage came out 3 years after the first one and sparked even more conversation. The research I'd done for it had revealed that my experience wasn't unusual. Countless women had seen their financial contributions minimized or erased entirely as their marriages progressed, often by the very men who'd initially been attracted to their intelligence and capability. The book tour for the second one was different from the first. Instead of surprised recognition, I was seeing anger, healthy, productive anger from women who were finally ready to reclaim their expertise. Instead of questions about whether they were overreacting, I was getting questions about how to document their contributions, how to protect their assets, how to rebuild their confidence. One woman in Phoenix, probably in her early 60s, asked a question that stayed with me for months. How do you forgive yourself for letting it happen? For letting someone convince you that you weren't capable of things you'd been doing successfully for years? I think I said carefully that we forgive ourselves by understanding that this wasn't a failure of intelligence or strength. This was a systematic process designed to make us doubt ourselves. The fact that it worked doesn't mean we were weak, it means it was effective. But I feel so stupid for falling for it. Would you feel stupid for believing a doctor who told you that you had a medical condition? Would you blame yourself for trusting a professional who convinced you that you needed treatment? No, of course not. This is the same thing. You trusted someone who claimed to love you, someone who was supposed to have your best interests at heart. The fact that they used that trust to manipulate you doesn't reflect poorly on your judgment. It reflects poorly on their character. The audience was nodding, and I could see the shift happening in real time. Women moving from self-blame to appropriate anger, from shame about their gullibility to recognition of their exploitation. The forgiveness comes, I continued, when you stop asking, how could I have been so stupid, and start asking, how could they have been so cruel? Because that's the real question. How could someone who claimed to love you systematically undermine your confidence? How could they take pleasure in making you feel small? How could they benefit from your diminishment? After that event, a reporter from a local newspaper asked me if I ever regretted staying in my marriage as long as I did. I regret not recognizing the pattern sooner, I said. I regret allowing myself to be convinced that my expertise had somehow evaporated just because someone I trusted told me it had. But I don't regret the time itself. It taught me things about myself and about relationships that I couldn't have learned any other way. What did it teach you? It taught me that love without respect is just control with better marketing. It taught me that financial independence isn't just about money. It's about maintaining the right to be your full self in a relationship. And it taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses. You think divorcing your husband was kind to him? I think continuing to let him treat me badly would have made him a worse person. People don't become better by being allowed to behave poorly without consequences. Maybe losing his marriage was the wake-up call Gary needed to examine his behavior. Though based on what I'd heard through the children, Gary hadn't done much examining. He'd simply found someone else who was willing to accept his need for control, someone who didn't challenge his assumption that he should be the final authority on all important decisions. That was his choice and Brenda's choice, and if it worked for them, I was genuinely happy for them. But it had never been my choice, not really. I'd been trained into it, manipulated into it, gradually convinced that accepting diminishment was the price of keeping peace. On my 70th birthday, James threw me a party that perfectly captured how different my life had become. Instead of a quiet family dinner where I served everyone else and cleaned up afterward, we had a celebration at the university faculty club where I was the guest of honor. My colleagues from the financial planning department were there, along with former students who'd become successful financial advisors, authors who'd written about similar topics, and women from around the country who'd been inspired by my story to reclaim their own expertise. Sarah gave a speech that made me cry. My mother taught me something important about being a woman, she said. She taught me that being loving doesn't mean being smaller, that being supportive doesn't mean being silent, that being a good partner means bringing your full self to the relationship, not hiding parts of yourself to make someone else feel more important. I didn't always know these things, she continued. For years, I watched my father treat my mother like she was less capable than she actually was, and I thought that was normal. I thought that was what marriage looked like. It took watching my mother reclaim her life to understand that love should make you bigger, not smaller. David nodded from across the room. He'd told me privately that my divorce had actually strengthened his own marriage because it had made him examine his own behavior toward his wife. I realized I was starting to do some of the same things Dad did, he'd said, making assumptions about what Linda could or couldn't handle, taking over decisions that should have been joint. Seeing Mom stand up for herself made me realize I needed to stand down and let Linda be a full partner. The evening was perfect in ways that had nothing to do with the elegant venue or the beautiful cake. It was perfect because I was surrounded by people who valued my intelligence, respected my expertise, and celebrated my strength rather than feeling threatened by it. As the party wound down and James and I were walking back to our car, he asked me something I'd been expecting. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Gary had been different? If he'd continued to respect your partnership instead of gradually undermining it? I thought about it for a moment. I think we probably would have stayed married and been reasonably happy. But I also think I would have spent my whole life being less than I could be. How do you figure that? Because even in the best version of that marriage, I would have been half of something instead of whole on my own. I would have been Gary's wife who happened to be good with money instead of Jennifer Hamilton who happened to be married. The divorce forced me to become completely myself in a way that even a good marriage might not have. Do you think all marriages require that kind of compromise? I think some do, and some don't. The difference is whether both people are compromising equally or whether one person is doing all the shrinking while the other person gets to expand. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, and I thought about the $18 million that had started this whole transformation. The money had been important. It had given me options, had provided the security I needed to leave an unsatisfying marriage. But the real transformation had been internal, the slow process of remembering who I was before I'd been convinced to be someone smaller. You know what the strangest part is? I said as we pulled into our driveway. What's that? I'm grateful to Gary, in a way. If he hadn't pushed me so far, if he hadn't made it so clear that he saw me as a burden, I might never have realized how much I'd been hiding my own light. Sometimes it takes being completely dismissed to remember how bright you actually are. James smiled. Remind me never to dismiss you. Oh, you couldn't if you tried. I'm past the age where I let people convince me I'm less than I am. And that, I realized, was the real victory. Not the $18 million, not the successful divorce, not even the new career and the books and the recognition. The real victory was the absolute certainty that I would never again let anyone make me feel smaller than I was. I had reclaimed not just my financial independence, but my right to be fully myself in every relationship and situation. At 72 years old, managing a portfolio worth over $30 million while teaching the next generation of financial planners and writing books that helped women reclaim their economic power, I knew with absolute certainty that I was finally exactly the right size. I was Jennifer Hamilton. Not someone's burden, not someone's diminished wife, but a woman who had learned that the most radical act of all is simply refusing to be smaller than you are. The woman who had stood in her garden that day, listening to her husband call her a burden, could never have imagined where those cruel words would lead. But sometimes the worst thing someone can say to you turns out to be the best gift they can give you. The gift of finally seeing yourself clearly, of finally understanding that you deserve better, of finally realizing that you have always been capable of creating the life you actually want. I was never Gary's burden. I was Jennifer Hamilton, investor, educator, mentor, wife to a man who celebrated my strength. I was a woman who had learned that love without respect is not love at all, and that the most beautiful thing you can do for someone is to be completely, unapologetically yourself. And in the end, that turned out to be more than enough.